Justin Vacula, recording here at the Pennsylvania Counseling Association Conference. I'm here with
Sara Grove.
And what brought you to the conference today?
I'm a student over at Kutztown University and a counseling major over there. So I came to the conference this weekend to present my paper on LGBTQ career counseling issues.
All right, so what's some of the things beyond that presentation?
In regards to my presentation, I put together a group on career counseling issues that LGBTQ young adults tend to deal with, especially in a college setting. It was focused on college students who already identify in the community and did most of their coming out process or working on their gender identity and sexual identity before they came to school as students on a college campus. So they hadn't really maybe thought about their career options because there's so much energy that goes into dealing with forming their own identity, being comfortable with who they are, dealing with the types of oppression that LGBTQ young adults deal with in high school. So the career group was about looking at their career options instead.
So what are some fields in college or majors that LGBT people typically fall into?
Well, the research that I did found that sometimes, more often than not, there are LGBTQ young adults who feel there's only certain fields that they might be accepted or comfortable being out in. So you'll tend to find a more accepting community, say, in the arts or in theater, or sometimes even in human services fields, counseling, psychology, places like that, which not every person who identifies as LGBTQ may feel that that's where their strengths are, but because there might be more of a level of comfort and acceptance, and if their priority is being able to be out and accepted by other people, which is more comforting for them, then they might go to those fields instead of looking at where all of their other skills, interests, hobbies, and everything else might lie. So the kind of goal was to ponder these things, look at them, look at their strengths, talk about what fears and issues they might have going out into the workplace if they'd never really thought about them before, and the types of oppression that LGBTQ people deal with in the workplace, and really just kind of having an open, comfortable, safe space to be able to talk about it.
So when LGBT individuals sacrifice their interests for where they feel more accepted, are there often high dropout rates or attrition rates in majors?
Well, what my research found mostly was that there just tends to be a lot of conflict. There tends to be conflict of what do I go into, where do I go. There tended to be a higher rate of young adults coming to college not knowing what they want to do, but coming to college for a social means and a social outlet, to be away from home. Maybe if they had parents that weren't comfortable with them being out, having a place to meet new people and to be themselves more comfortably, instead of coming to college with an intent of a major and career ideas and education ideas. So yeah, you would see an increased dropout rate with that. The other thing that I found that was interesting was most of the research done in the field of career counseling that relates to the LGBTQ community is done on either gay men or lesbian women. There's really no research out there on bisexual or pansexual individuals or transgender individuals. There's very, very minimal.
What are some particular difficulties that gay men face?
Specifically, gay men, there can be issues of coming out, being out in the workplace, the way that people tend to treat men in regards to gender stereotypes. So let's say if you have a young man who wants to go into STEM work, so he wants to go into engineer, sciences, anything like that, the amount of acceptance and understanding and communication and socialization in STEM work is just not very high. So you might see a gay man who is very skilled in these fields feel like he can't do that, or go into a different but somewhat related field, or avoid it altogether simply because he's out, he's comfortable with himself, but he can't find a way to make his career path that he's skilled with work well with his gender identity and sexual orientation and the person the relationships that he wants to have. So that's really a lot of research on gay men tends to point in those directions, and those particular issues that men deal with in coming out, in being treated, not being oppressed and being treated well by others, and being able to be open about their relationships in the workplace.
So compared to women, there are often high rates of suicide with men, and especially gay men.
Well, in general, when it comes to suicide statistics, men, I think it's middle-aged to older white men are at the highest risk of completing a suicide. I'm pretty sure that's where the statistics are. It's been a little while since I did a suicide assessment class, but last I looked at the research, that's what it was. So men are at a greater at-risk group for going through with a suicide attempt. I think it's that women have a higher rate of attempting suicide. Men have a higher rate of going through with it and using means that are much more deadly. I know that men are more often use guns or other weapons, whereas I think it's just less common with women. I wouldn't want to cite a particular statistic that's wrong in it, but I do know that that's much higher risk for men. So I would imagine amongst gay men, gay-identified men, or bisexual-identified men, because despite what some research tries to say about bisexuality in men, there are numerous men that identify as bisexual, and every time somebody tries to put out research saying that bisexuality doesn't exist amongst men, it really erases an entire population. But I imagine that those men would be at an even higher risk for those kinds of issues.
All right, very good. You said in our conversation earlier that you were involved in some groups on campus?
Mm-hmm. Part of my work there is I'm the educator for a group called Heart at KU, which is our campus sexual assault and relationship violence advocacy and education group. So I'm the student educator. I go classroom to classroom. I educate students on campus about what sexual assault is, what it looks like, how to prevent it, because safety tips are really not that useful. Prevention is really what's important, and that's across the board, talking to both men and women about what they can do to help prevent these issues before they start. And then also relationship violence and healthy discussions on sex and sexuality. Along with that, I'm a representative of our feminist group on campus called the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, so FMLI.
not the
I had to think about it for a
future
minute.
business leaders of America, the FBLA.
No, I had to think about the acronym for a minute.
Oh, there's so many out there. All right, so let's talk about prevention of sexual assault. In many online spheres, and even in general, it seems to be very difficult to even have the discussion, because if people say this is what you can do to be more safe, or these are some situations you should avoid, people often get attacked to say that you're a rape apologist, or you're making excuses for people, or you're blaming the victim. So have you heard these discussions before? Well,
now I can't cite any specific discussions, but I'm familiar with terms like rape apologists and victim blaming. I do a whole discussion on victim blaming when I do my campus education piece. I think it's really about the approach. The internet, unfortunately, it's not a very good sphere sometimes for talking about these issues, because the language we use sometimes can be very hurtful and uncomfortable for people. If somebody who has never been victimized if somebody who's never been a victim of sexual assault or rape might use terminology or say things in a certain way that can be very hurtful or to somebody who has been victimized, or if they're using victim blaming language, emotions can run very high, and arguments will happen, and the internet is really not a great place to argue. What one of my friends says, winning an argument on the internet is like, being the loudest kindergartner in a screaming match. Like, it's really just, it's not really that, it's not a very good place to do that. That's why I think, with the work I do, it's really a positive thing that I'm going into the classrooms and I'm looking at people face to face and I'm talking about these issues with them right there. Even if they're not really into having the conversation right then and there, at least they're leaving with some of the knowledge. And in the past, I actually used to do that work with a male co-facilitator, and it made it even better, because one of the biggest things that we try to get across is that this isn't an issue for women, this is an issue for everyone. And that goes across a whole bunch of different things. I mean, men can be victims of sexual assault and rape also. Men can be victims of relationship violence. And while the higher number of victims of relationship violence and sexual violence are women, usually what you're hearing about is women being perpetrated on by men. So why wouldn't men want to be a part of this conversation and speak up, as the majority of men don't do these sorts of things? The majority of men that I ever talk to, they don't want to abuse people they're dating. They don't want to hurt, they don't want to see women in their lives hurt. They don't want to commit sexual assault or rape. They want to have a positive, good, like consensual sexual experience. So why don't we all want to speak up about this? And that's really one of the things that I've been trying to press in my work, is that it's something for everyone to talk about. It's not just a women's issue. Just because I come from the Women's Center on campus, just because I'm a female appearing person, it doesn't mean that it's not for men too. In fact, the more men we have speaking up about this stuff, and the more that they want to learn, and the more that they want to be educated, and the more that they want to be active in speaking up about it, the better off that we are.
Some of the rhetoric is, men are potential rapists, don't be that guy. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be portraying it as a gendered issue, where men are the perpetrators, women are the victims, and it's never the other way around, or reciprocal violence or anything.
Because statistically, the predominant number of reports that come in are women being perpetrated on by men. A lot of activism seems to, like, obviously you're going to start with the biggest group. Do you know what I mean? Now, that doesn't mean that you neglect everything else. Like when I do my presentations, I always have a discussion piece in there about men that are victims of sexual violence. I give it's about 3% of American men have reported a rape in their lifetime or a sexual assault. That's a statistic that's drastically lower than it probably actually is, because I think that was before they changed the federal definition for rape to include things like prison rape, sodomy, all that.
It was before it was that it had to involve penetration.
It had to involve specifically like penis and vagina penetration, essentially. They changed that, thankfully. So now at some point we'll get a statistic that's better representative of men that have been victimized. But I mean, I always have that talking piece in there. And, it's not just because it's like, hey guys, pay attention to this little statistic. It's because that issue matters a lot. Men are victims too, but the predominant number of cases that get reported are women being victimized by men. So obviously, we need to kind of start there, you know what I mean? It's also the one that we tend to notice more. Kind of like when I talk about relationship violence, I make it a point to talk about emotional abuse, because we all notice physical abuse. We see when somebody's bruised. We see when they're scared and they're physically been hurt by a partner. Emotional abuse doesn't actually have any physical look to it, so you want to know what that look. You want to know the signs. You want to know what to look for. You want to know what to listen to, because it gets overlooked. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So like it's the you want to be aware of those things, but there's stuff that makes it much more prevalent that is a good place to start, which is why you hear a lot about how if somebody's being physically abused in a relationship, that's a big sign to move them out of there. Do you know what I mean? To do something, to pick up. So on that, when it comes to sexual assault, if the highest percentage of reports are women being victimized by men, of course we're going to start there. And I think that the more male voices that we have saying, like, yeah, I disagree with this, so the don't be that guy thing, you're right, it comes off very gendered, but it's a way to reach men sometimes. It's a way to, like, hey guys, be aware of these issues, you know what I mean? I actually just started this year doing some of my educational pieces with fraternities on my campus, which was a very interesting experience. And I actually found that the two fraternities that I worked with, the guys in there were really receptive, because I talked about it with them in a way like that. Like, hey guys, wouldn't you want to be educated in what consent is and how if somebody's intoxicated or passed out, they can't consent to sex. You know what I mean? So if somebody's unconscious, they can't consent to sex. Legally, if you have sex with somebody who's unconscious, like by legal standards, that's considered rape because they can't consent. You know, it's like, wouldn't you guys want to know this? So if your buddy's like, hey, I'm going to hook up with this cute girl over here tonight, and she's literally about to pass out, wouldn't you want to be the friend who goes, hey, maybe not tonight. Why don't you give her a call tomorrow? And not only are you helping that girl who could have been victimized, you're helping your friend at this point because he may not have known. You know, he may have had no idea. We're so uneducated about these issues sometimes. That's why education is such an important piece.
So we talk about intoxication, and I think that can often, in some ways, get the numbers to be way up because some of the definitions of rape that I've seen include any alcohol consumption, not of an unconscious thing, but even maybe one drink. If they're both drinking, are they both rapists? You know what?
The legal definition said, when you're talking about consent and an inability to, if someone is considered legally intoxicated, then they cannot consent for sex. So the awful truth of it is if a bunch of people get together and they all drink, technically now that there's been alcohol consumed legally, so we're going by like the law stuff here, they can't consent to sex. Now that doesn't mean that every time a bunch of people get together at a party and drink that everybody who had sex that night has been sexually assaulted, because there's a lot of I think my statistic for this one is that 80% of college students, 80% of college students who talked about having a regrettable sexual experience said that alcohol was involved. So they're like, yeah, I really didn't want to do that, but I wouldn't have done it if I was sober, but whatever.
So is this consent changing after the fact? So they were happy then, but then the next day?
It was just it was more of a report on the influence that alcohol has on bad decision making was actually where that came from. But I think that just kind of puts in a framework that we don't always make the best decisions when we're drunk. So that's why that's part of the legal that's why it's part of the legal issue when it comes to consent. If you're not making sound decisions, then how can you make a sound decision about about having sex with someone? So that's why it's in there. Now, the more that we're aware of this, the more that we know that, especially in a college campus sort of situation, if alcohol's involved at a party, the chances of somebody reporting rape or sexual assault are a lot higher, because what if somebody doesn't realize what they're doing the next day? And actually, I think that's why sometimes these are tough conversations to have when you're not face-to-face with somebody, because that's when you get a lot of victim-blaming language. It's like, well, don't drink so much, then you won't get assaulted. And it's like, yeah, but we don't really say, who are you to police somebody's decisions? Do you know what I mean? Why shouldn't a group of people be able to get together and they might all get very drunk and they might all pass out without a fear of somebody coming, and since rape is about power and control, it's not even really always about sex anymore, somebody taking advantage of you while you're almost unconscious. Why do we have to have that fear? Instead of telling people, well, don't drink and don't dress like that and don't act this way, we should go, well, how about we just respect that if somebody can't actually make a proper decision about having sex that night or not, we just kind of move away from it. We go, all right, another time.
That's what really gets me, is that if there's this idea that this sexual assault on campus is so prevalent, then it would probably be in everyone's best interest to stay away from getting really, really drunk.
Yeah, and actually, whenever I do that piece, whenever I get to that part of my presentation, I always make it a point to tell students, look, I'm not here to tell you all don't drink and don't party.
Temperance movement here.
Yeah, but that's not what it's about. See, that's my whole thing when I talk about prevention. Is I'm not out there to tell people how much they can drink, how little what they should be doing, where they should go, how they should dress, whether they should party or not, because I think that if you're educated in these issues, we'll see a reduction of this. If everyone's aware of the fact that if somebody's drunk, they can't consent to sex, and they're like, well, I'd rather have a good sexual experience and get a positive yes from them than just kind of go along with it and wonder, you know what I mean? Then maybe they'll wait a moment and not have sex with the person who's about to fall over.
So it could be pretty complicated, not too clear cut.
It is, and I mean, I always get the question well, what if both people are drunk? Does that mean they just assaulted each other? It's like, well, if both people wake up the next morning and feel that they were assaulted by the other, they could both report it. They really could both legally report it, but I mean, I'm not a legal expert. I'm a counseling major. You know what I mean? And it gets very complicated from there, because then it starts looking at like, well, was one party using alcohol to manipulate the other person? Were they trying to get them drunk to have sex with them? Do you see what I mean? Because again, like rape and sexual assault isn't a crime that's really about like having sex anymore. It's about taking something that wasn't freely given out.
So I hear this language of getting drunk, and I'm often confused with this, because if someone is, say, giving you a drink, saying, hey, drink this, the person could always say, I'm not interested.
Yeah. But accepting
it seems to take away a person's volition.
What do you mean?
In that if we're saying, well, he got her drunk, she's just this puppet and she's not acting, it's like, oh, sure, and it seems to really disempower women.
And that's kind of reflecting on the idea that it's going in the framework of people who use alcohol or recreational drugs or anything like that as a means to lower someone's inhibition to be able to have sex with them. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, all right, well, if I buy her like 5 drinks and she's so tipsy she won't even want to say no. Do you see what I mean? That's where that framework comes out of. Now it could be that both of them are buying drinks for each other and they're both drunk. You know what I mean? But the thing about that though is accepting a drink isn't consent. Legally, the only way you can give consent is verbally. So I always tell some of the students and stuff, they'll be like, well, what if she goes out and she's like in a bra, like pasties and a thong? Doesn't that mean she wants to get laid tonight? And I'm like, well, she could literally be wearing a sign that says, I want to have sex with someone tonight, but just because she has that sign on...
Right, it's not consent.
Yeah, you have to go up and still check in.
I don't really think that's a serious conversation worth acknowledging, but do you hear this often?
Oh, I literally have somebody in my class once that said, like, what if a girl goes out like that? Doesn't mean she wants to have sex. Like, I mean, these are real questions I get from people. I also had somebody tell me once, well, I don't want to ask for consent, because that means I'm going to ruin the mood by asking her if she wants to do it. And I was like, but wouldn't you rather know if she actually wants to?
So what about situations where like people start touching each other and feeling, and they're going along with it, they're increasing it, but there's no verbal activity? Well,
I think in scenarios like that, like if somebody's uncomfortable, first of all, this is why I really advocate for being able to be comfortable talking about sex, because as a culture, we're just not. If somebody's uncomfortable with the touching that's happening, they should feel confident and say like, hey,
no thanks.
Yeah. You know what, like, hey, this was really fun. I liked making out or whatever we were doing, but I think I want to call it cuts here. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, we don't tend to teach and empower people like from a young age on up to be comfortable saying yes or no to sex. So that's already an issue right there. That's already a problem to begin with. But then in the event that that's happening and there's no verbal stuff going on right there, when somebody finally does say like, hey, could we stop? The other person should respect them and be like, all right, let's stop. You know what I mean?
Right. So for the people who engage, there's no verbal, but there's the touching, there's the activity, they go along with it. But then the next day they say, I never said yes, or there wasn't this crystal clear consent or something. And can that fall under the definition of rape?
I think there are definitely circumstances where you could see a scenario painted like that, but I think really what also would play a part in that, and because this is just a theoretical sort of scenario, we can't see all the other factors. It's like, well, was the person who was kind of initiating it, were they being a little forceful about it, like just without saying anything? Were they, was their touch really forceful? Did they kind of hold them there? Did they not really give the other person an option to kind of move out of it? Did they corner them? Did they say something earlier that night like, like if we don't do this, I'm dumping you? Do you know what I mean? Like, were there other circumstances like that might have made the other party in that scenario, so we're not being gendered about it there, but the other person feel afraid to say no? Because sometimes people, again, because we don't always teach the language, we don't encourage people to be comfortable talking about their sexuality or whether or not they want sex or anything like that. We don't encourage that in people enough. So somebody could be victimized that way.
So self-esteem, assertiveness, these are things that people will have to build.
In general, yeah, and just I think a comfort level with sexual activity, we don't educate, we don't talk to teenagers about we don't give them real comprehensive sex education. You know, we teach about STDs, we teach about pregnancy.
Abstinence.
We teach about abstinence. Don't even get me started on abstinence, only sex ed. But we teach about stuff like that. We don't talk about consent. We don't talk about, like, we don't tell, like, young boys and girls, hey, it's okay to say no. You know what I mean? It's okay to do that. There is an amazing video I watched. It was when I was doing my prevention education piece for my training, and it was a video of I can't remember the actor's name. He did a TED Talk, and he was talking about, like, men and their role in helping to prevent violence against women and sexual assault. And he was essentially giving a story about how when he was younger, his particular neighborhood, like, all boys his age were supposed to think about was like women and sex. And
was this Glenn Poole?
It might have been. I can't remember who it was right now. I just remember it was a very fascinating and moving story about how essentially an older boy told him, like, here, you can get some, and showed him into a room where there was a girl who was who had a mental disability and probably didn't know what was going on. And he was put in this room and expected to have sex with her, and he didn't want to, and he didn't know what to do. So instead, he kind of waited there for a little while and then left and kind of went like, yeah, you know, I did this, and left. This idea that men aren't supposed to be able to, like, not be interested in sex with someone is an awful gender stereotype. And this idea that women aren't interested in sex at all is another awful gender stereotype. I mean, as a couples and family track counseling student, you know, I'm in the middle of doing some of my work on, like, couples counseling, my seminar on marital therapies. I'm looking to go into sex therapy in the future as one of my specialties. You know, people just aren't comfortable talking about sex, and we do these awful, sweeping stereotypes of what men and women think about sex. If we started teaching people from a young age, like, look, it's okay to say no, and it's also okay to say yes, and if you are going to say yes, here's how you stay safe, and here's things you can do. You know, we don't teach anybody about how sex is more than just penetration, so it's really like heteronormative sex education. So, you know, if you're an LGBT high schooler and you're like, I don't know anything now. Like, you didn't really teach me anything. Like, so it's just, I think a root in all of this stuff, in a lot of the work that I do, a root of it is better education about sex and a better understanding and a better comfort level. So. Yeah,
with male victims of assault, they might hear things like, oh, what are you, gay? Or how could you not like it? What's wrong with you?
Sexual assault and rape are already severely underreported in general, so it's one of the most underreported crimes that's out there. For male victims, the chances of a man reporting rape or sexual assault is even worse than women trying to report rape or sexual assault because of the type of victim-blaming attitudes people take and the type of gender stereotypes that we do. So for men, it might be like they might go to try and report it and literally just be told that they're a joke. There's still people out there that don't actually believe men can be victims of rape and sexual assault. And even if they do try to report, they might be like, well, didn't you like it? Like, what do you mean that you had a problem with it? Especially if they were victimized by a woman. They might essentially just get told that it's not even worth looking into. Like, well, you know, you obviously, like, you had an orgasm, so you must have liked it. No, that's not how non-consensual. I mean, there can be penetration, there can be orgasm. If it wasn't consensual, then it was sexual assault or rape, you know? Like, we need to educate people on these things and get a better level of understanding and really get rid of these gender stereotypes that are out there. And I think people will be much more comfortable talking about these issues.
So you mentioned the word feminism earlier, and some of the problems I've had with it online is it often sets men as the oppressor. There's this patriarchy, women are oppressed by men, and it's this gender war that often seems to be set up from the internet, at least from what I've seen.
Well, when we're talking about like feminism, when we're talking about sexism especially, just like with different forms of oppression, I mean, there is a group that has historically been in power. And then a group that has been historically oppressed. And you can run down the entire line with it. Like, I mean, when we talk about racism, we're talking about as white people white people have historically had a level of power. People of color have historically been oppressed. So in sexism, we're talking about men have historically had power. Women have historically been oppressed. And that's not to say that it's supposed to be like, women like coming in this uprising and like smashing down men. It's about rising up and getting to a level of equality between men and women. And I think there's this misunderstanding that tends to happen a lot, that like somehow feminists are anti-men or hate men or want to see men fall or want to bring down men and tear down and like throw them into an oppressed group. Do you know what I mean? Like, here, see how you like it over there. And that's not what it's about. It's about building a level of inequality. It's about educating people about the historic oppression of women and why we should all be on a level playing field. And sometimes that means working on special circumstances to help women that have been historically disempowered. And I think that's where people get frustrated. When confronted with privilege, people get afraid, they get pent up. They're like, well, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean that I have some sort of privilege? You know what I mean? Because we don't notice it. We don't notice our privilege till we have to unpack it and look at it finally. And I think that's where some of those arguments come out of, is I think there's a misunderstanding about feminism, because sometimes when people hear it, especially like sometimes when I talk to men about feminism, they're like, well, I don't know what your problem is with it, you know what I mean? Like, how can you have a women's center on campus but on a men's center? It's like, well, because historically, women needed a place to go sit down and talk to someone about issues that might be unique for them, so we have a support group on it for campus. Well, what about my support group? It's like, you probably have a lot more opportunities for that, It's about like leveling things out. It's not about saying like you're wrong because you have power and shutting down men as a whole. It's about working together more. That's why I think it's so important to talk to men about feminism and talk about hear men's thoughts on equality between gender, and then be able to kind of show them like, hey, guess what? Everything you just described is what feminism does. That's not to say that there aren't radical aspects of any sort of movement group. Do you know what I mean? There are definitely radical parts, groups in feminism, I'm sure, that may have a really a more negative outlook on things, but the majority of people I talk to identify as feminists. They're not these crazy man-hating shut down men everywhere, make women in charge of everything. That's not the ideals behind it. It's about educating and getting a better level of understanding and undoing systematic oppression, just like with any other sort of advocacy and activism that's out there, which I think as counselors is really important for future counselors to have some part of advocacy or activism that they're interested in, that they work on. Mine just happens to be in the realm of gender and sexism and heterosexism.
I've happened to distance myself from the label because of some of the conversations that happen where people say, well, you just don't understand because you're a man, and instead of actually explaining something, it's just the attacking, and you need to check your privilege, and you're just mansplaining, and you can't possibly know what it's like, and you weren't a victim of sexual assault. Like, these are some of the things that happen that break down the conversations.
And what's interesting about that, I think, is there really is a need to educate people more, and that's one of the reasons I do the work that I do, and why I enjoy my work so much, because I like having the conversations about it and I like educating. But one of the things that I think is important is for people to also realize that when we're talking about oppression, it's good to educate yourself too. So one of the things that in an experience I had over the summer where I worked at a social justice day camp, was we talk about different types of oppression. Each day kind of has a focus, and one of those days was on racism. And that was a really great experience for me because I got to learn a lot more about some of the issues that people of color were concerned with, and things that they had experienced, and things that I just weren't aware of that they deal with on a regular basis. And one of the things that we do in activity is there's a part where people in the oppressed group can stand up and make statements about things they've experienced, things they want from their allies, stuff like that. And the other group, people who would identify on the side that would have more power, have to listen and be present and respond. It's almost a little bit counseling-esque, you know what I mean? Just kind of being there in the moment. But afterwards, if there's something that you heard from the group, from the oppressed group that you didn't understand, they encourage you to go talk to your peers on your side of the room instead of going and asking them. So instead of being like, instead of going up to a woman when we're talking about sexism and being like, so why does it bother you that people tell girls in short skirts that they're slutty? Do you know what I mean? Instead of asking her a question like that, it's 2013. We have the magic of the internet. The internet is not perfect. It's bad for conversations. It's great for information, though. It's really easy to type in, like, sexism, clothing, victim blaming, and get 8 million fantastically written pieces about why victim blaming isn't cool and why we shouldn't be, like, slut-shaming women and why people should be allowed to wear what they want without being a victim of rape or sexual assault. Instead of going up to a woman and saying, hey, explain this to me. You educate me. Because not everybody wants to be an educator, you know what I mean? Like, I like being an educator, but not every person out there who's an activist for equality feels comfortable educating. If you're talking to somebody who's been a victim of a lot of some really violent crimes or some really painful situations, they may not be the right person to educate or to be an educator. Do you see what I mean?
So if they don't want to educate, what I often see is the shaming online and the calling out, where instead of coming to someone and saying, hey, this thing you said that was phrased poorly, or there could have been a better way you said this, or when you say this, I think of this, and this is why this is bad, because people can generally be unaware. If someone uses a certain phrase, other people might claim offense, right? There are certainly things that we don't know because we don't have the experiences of other people. There's, in the NFL, there's discussion going on about the Washington Redskins and the name change, and some people might be unaware of what the connotations come with the name Redskin, for instance, right? So I think a productive way to say is, well, this is why these people are angry about this, and this is why the change should happen, instead of, well, you're just a racist and a bigot if you think the name should be the same or something, right?
And I mean, unfortunately, we can't, if people are part of an oppressed group, it's not our place, I guess, as people on the other side sometimes, to tell them when they're allowed to be angry and when they're not. So, if somebody goes up online and let's say uses a really awful racial slur, like one that would normally evoke like a feeling of like, wow, that wasn't right from anyone, but they don't get why they did it, I'm not going to stop a person of color from being like, yo, that was really wrong, can you not do that? I'm not going to stop them because they have the right to be angry because that's a word or a term or something that really hurt them. And that person should probably, again, it's 2013, be aware that that kind of language wasn't a smart move, you know what I mean? And some people approach with frustration or anger because of systematic oppression they've dealt with, and other people have a different approach. It might be more educational, it might be more understanding, it might have a lot more empathy behind it, but that's because, again, not all of us get the training that, like, like people like you or I are getting, like, with counseling and empathy building and teaching about boundaries and educating people and empowering people, you know what I mean? Not everybody has that, and that's not their fault, you know what I mean? But they can still be activists for something that they know, that they feel strongly about, and that they want to see change with. Would it be great if everybody could approach an issue of oppression or something very offensive in a healthy educational mindset? Yeah, it would be awesome. The thing is there's still so many people out there who, like, for me, I'll give an example from one of my classes that I did. So I do these presentations all the time on a really regular basis. I go in, it's the same presentation I always give. I try to make it a very engaging, down-to-earth discussion on sexual assault and relationship violence. And I will still get, at least once a semester, one snarky person who will respond to my survey, because I do a survey every time, with something like, like, what did you learn about today? Like, what's something that you learned about today? Like, they'll write something like, it's okay to rape anyone. And I'm like, you know what? I'm tired of you're trying to be funny. It's not funny. This isn't a funny topic. Do you know what I mean? But there's always somebody out there who's going to try to push these boundaries and think that, freedom of speech means freedom to be an asshole.
Well, it's likely trolling is what they're doing, right? And especially with the internet, these aren't serious people in the discussion. But
I mean, the thing is, though, is those few people that are out there, it's what continues the level of frustration. Do you see what I mean? Like, I don't let it get to me because I know I'm also reaching a lot of people, like men and women, who really value the information I'm giving them. So I let it roll like water off of me,
As
you know?
if you attack and shame people, then they're not going to be receptive to your message.
Exactly. But I mean, you know, if I was getting that every day, if every time I did a presentation, I was getting a handful of people coming up and you know, telling me a rape joke or telling me that I deserve to be raped because I'm talking about this, after a while, it's going to really build some resentment, you know what I mean? And all of a sudden, somebody might say the wrong thing, and the anger will well up, and it'll be like, you know, screw you, you know, like, you know, and start like dropping all like the really awful sort of like responses there. And that's why I think we see some of this stuff, because there's still so many people out there who make a joke out of issues of oppression, and people who are really being hurt or oppressed by it are really tired of their very serious situations being made into a joke. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I mean, some of my experiences, I've received a lot of hate mail from religious individuals when I would tackle church-state separation issues. But I'm not going out there and saying all religious people are idiots, they're mentally wrong, or they're all unintelligent or something. I don't think it's a productive way to say things. I've received a lot of email. People have really gone far with things. And I think it's important to try to stay positive and try to reach out to people, because there are a lot of people who can genuinely really be lacking understanding about certain issues.
Yeah.
When I hear things like, oh, well, atheists have no morals, or why do you bother living? Why don't you just kill yourself? Or, you know,
these are things
like
that have been actually said to you?
Oh, yeah. But I don't really, you know, I can be angry about it, but I'm not going to manifest that and lash out at people and be nasty to people, because I understand there's the room for learning there.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, I think that's because, you know, we're all different. Everybody involved in a movement or involved in a group and stuff, no two people are identical, you know what I mean? And everybody's going to deal with things in different ways. And I guess you could almost think of it like, you know, where our outlet mutually for both of our situations would be more on the educational side, and kind of keeping the calm and being like, look, here's some information to kind of help you out. Other people, and we, again, because we don't know their experiences, might just be so fed up with it, you know what I mean? I think that if somebody gets told so many times, like the type of hate mail that you were just saying you've received, I think maybe somebody else who maybe isn't like involved in like the online world or blogging or like doing the work that you do, might hear that so often that they might just get really sick and tired and make sweeping things like, you know, well, screw all religions, you know what I mean? Because obviously this is how they treat me. And that, again, that comes out of being hurt or oppressed or shot down by a group in power. Because, I mean, technically, when we're talking about religion, your group in power there would be essentially Christian faith. Do you know what I mean? Here in America, that would be the group in power. The disempowered group is everything else.
Yes.
That's actually, when we were doing our oppression chart, that was exactly how we put up there. We're like Christians, everyone else. So you know what I mean? Just like when we're talking about like race and like white individuals and people of color, everyone else.
Yeah.
So I mean, in that scenario, I mean, because and again, I'm not like really knowledgeable or well-versed in like the atheist community or anything, but I do know that every once in a while, if a topic of religion comes up somewhere, every once in a while I'll see the one person who pops up with a comment and be like, you know, screw all religion, it's terrible. Do you know what I mean? It's like, oh no, like that one person is now just making it like that one person with their hurt and dealing with the oppression they might have felt with from churches or from religious organizations is out there being angry, and now everyone's going to use that as a negative example. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so I mean, in my position, what I usually do when I hear things like that is I'll say to people like, hey, this might not be the best way to approach things. You're just going to shut people down, but I can't necessarily police everyone.
Exactly.
So
and
it's really difficult.
That's the whole thing. We can't police how people are going to deal with their anger or their frustration. I mean, we just can't. And when we're talking about an oppressed group, we can't do that to them, because, you know, people have the right to feel the way they're going to feel, especially if they've been hurt.
But I guess the issue is, what is the best way to go about things? Is there a better way than another? I mean, like, I think we would draw the line in violence, saying that violence is unacceptable, right? So if we could draw a line somewhere, there have to be some better ways, some more socially acceptable ways, right?
And you know, it's interesting because I think about, like, I specifically think about like the internet and stuff, and how the internet is such a great tool for information, for activism, for change, for discussing different issues, for being aware of the diversity of people across every spectrum. Do you know what I mean? And yet it's the worst place to have a good discussion about it, because I think when we don't have to look people face to face, when we don't have to recognize their humanness, when we can hide behind things like anonymity, I think people have this like weird sort of need to just like see how far they limit test. They want to see how far they can push these boundaries until they do so, like to get some sort of rise. And that is an awful, awful, awful playing field to be on when we want to talk about these issues. So I don't even know how we would change it yet. I really don't. I'd like to see. I think as I keep going with my work, maybe I'll start finding ways to do it.
And more of like a pick up the phone type deal. Why don't you talk to this person?
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm not very involved online just yet in talking about issues like this, because I'm afraid I don't know the best way to deal with it yet. Not like I would go on there screaming at anyone, but I think it would actually, like, I'd be almost a little bit concerned at how much lashback I'd get. Do you know what I mean? And not knowing how to handle it in a way where I could educate. Like when I was saying earlier about how, discussions on on sexism and its relation to things like the gaming community. I don't want to be another like female gamer online who gets told how much she needs to get raped or assaulted just because I'm talking about these issues. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to be a part of that. I think I have, I'd rather just have the conversation face to face, because I guarantee you, if I'm looking at a whole bunch of people and having the discussion with them right in front of me, their chances of saying something like that, because that's pretty offensive and awful, probably pretty low. But that's because they don't have that safety net of the internet in front of them. I think if we could start talking about these topics face to face with people, that would probably make things go more productively. And unfortunately, the internet is a great tool to reach more people. But now we've got this weird barrier up that it's not a very good tool to have the discussion.
Yeah, I think something, too, that gets in the way is the model of blogging, where if you get more hits, you'll get more money, you'll get more views.
Yeah.
So people can try to stir drama intentionally and provoke people to get those views and to get those hits and be nasty, because that's what gets the readers, right? The online world is very complex. It's a very complex place. So I guess I would hope that people have more genuine discussion, turn anger into something more productive, and talk about the issues, right?
And I think I guess like one good point that I always give when I do my prevention work and stuff is I usually encourage people to try and not use the angry language sometimes, like if they can, especially if you're trying to educate others about stuff. So my one example was when I talked about hey, you're educated about sexual assault now, so if you had a friend who was like, I'm going to go hook up with this girl over there and she's very, very drunk, she obviously can't consent, I was like, you can say something to him. And I tell everybody, I'm like, I don't want you to go up to your friend and be like, you're about to be a rapist. That's not going to help. What you can say is, hey, that's probably not a good idea. She might not even know what's going on. So why don't you just leave her your number, or give her a call tomorrow. Let's go do something else. I don't want people to go out there and start throwing around accusations like that. I just think if we as a whole can come together and be educated and then provide that stuff for other people who may not know in a positive or a comforting way, not an accusatory way, that we'd probably be better off. But again, I mean, that's me talking to a group of people, like men and women being allies to victims of sexual assault. I'm not going to tell somebody who's already been victimized not to be angry that they were victimized. I can't do that.
I think there's still a distinction of saying to someone, don't be angry, versus here's a way to best address this issue. I don't think it's really possible, or maybe people say don't be angry about that. Are people really saying, well, that's not an issue, or don't worry about that anymore, or get over it? There might be some of that, but I think there's a distinction between being effective communicator versus being unreasonable. If people are starting to flip tables and interrupt events and hijack question and answer sessions or something.
And I mean, and again, I think a lot of that anger comes out of not being listened to for a long time. I really think that's where some of it comes from. And that's why it's so important to start making those changes. So we're listening to people, and maybe some of the anger will start to abate finally. You know what I mean? Because when you're not listened to for so long, when you're talking about something that is important, or people are making a joke out of what you know is an important issue that needs to be dealt with, eventually the anger is going to build up somewhere, and then you are going to be flipping tables because you're tired of it, you know? Like, it'll get to the point where it's just like, I'm so done. Now I need to be as loud as possible.
So maybe that's where the internet could come in, where people can find similar people, I guess, to use that language.
Similar people to flip tables with, I guess.
I guess so.
But
it's table flipping in the future.
Yeah, and I think we'll slowly get there. But again, I just think that the more we talk about this stuff and the more that we educate, and even with the internet being the kind of terrible spot it can be sometimes with it, it'll eventually get there.
Yeah, I think even coming out of this, maybe a feminist will listen and say, oh, you're just a gender traitor or a chill girl, and I've heard a lot of this language before where there's...
Well, and I mean, if somebody really wanted to think that of me for having this kind of discussion, then I guess that's their thought. I'm sure that I could go then and talk to about like 30 other people I know that I work with. That'd be like, you're like the least offensive person we know, and I'd be like, all right, thanks.
Yeah, maybe own the label, I guess. if that's what it means to talk about issues facing everyone and being equality-minded, I guess that's the way to go. And
I mean, I think really, if anything, the biggest part of my message would be that, when we're talking about feminism, so we're talking about equality. We need to remember to recognize the historic oppression, the historic sexism, why we have to kind of dismantle it. So.
All right, very good. All right, thanks for chatting.
No, thanks for having me.
And people can find out about you more where?
I don't really have like a website or anything like set up. I don't really have much of an online presence yet, though. I'm hoping to change that in the future. But I guess they could
email?
Yeah. Through if anybody wanted to email, my email address is Nendine NENDINE @gmail.com.
All right, very good, and we're looking forward to 2 more days of the conference.
Yeah. Thank you so much.